Good morning, everyone. From large public venues to enterprises, traditional in-building architectures such as DAS are really starting to show their limits with complexity, space consumption, time, long installation processes, et cetera. ORAN has really been posed as the game changer for in-building wireless, and you're hearing a lot about ORAN this week. Well, it's really being posed as the solution to be able to minimize CapEx and minimize OpEx in venues of all types, from large to small. So today, really this panel is about redefining in-building coverage with ORAN and really trying to deep dive some of those issues. And we have a fantastic panel here today to discuss that, right? We have an operator, we have a couple of the major RAN OEMs, and we have a manufacturer of specifically of in-building systems. So really, welcome to all our panelists today, and thanks for joining us. The first question, really, I want to kind of dive in and just take it from the basics. And what are the fundamental architecture changes really involving ORAN, this digital interface? I mean, what does it all really mean? Let's deep dive that a little bit. If you want to comment on that first, Akhil.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Ben. And I think there's a lot of theme that we've been talking a lot about when it comes to ORAN and DAS. And the way we look at it is essentially an integration in three aspects, right? The first one is head-end simplification. We talked a lot about that. This previous speaker mentioned it as well. Moving from RF analog signal source to more of a digital front haul is a significant change I think we can leverage upon. So head-end simplification is a big theme, and I think we'll see a lot of that. The second one is how we can leverage the ORAN standards to ensure that you not only get the flexibility from a multi-vendor integration point of view, but the observability, right? Typically for these enterprise venues, the biggest challenge has been the visibility. It's always been siloed. It's been more of, okay, you get what you get because of the limitations of the architecture. ORAN with the SMO architecture helps you to enable something a little bit different than what the enterprise and the operators have experienced in the past. And finally, it's the TCO conversation, right? Because you're simplifying the head end, there is cost reductions, and then how you move forward. In Ericsson, we view that in two steps. I think DAS with ORAN is a very good first step. But at the end of the day, what you're really trying to solve is ubiquitous coverage. Ubiquitous coverage means that it's not only in macro outside, you need to bring that coverage back indoor. And how do you solve that in a phased approach where you have radios being deployed where the capacity needs are?
Okay, Shawnee, would you like to add anything to that?
Yeah, thank you, Akhil. I think Akhil has covered majority of the points. I just would like to add a couple additional points to that. The other aspect that I see is the virtualization technology on the BBU side. So with the virtualization, what you see is the BBU interface towards the DAS is basically very flexible. It's very scalable, and it can steer the traffic dynamically in a rapid fashion. So basically, it improves your coverage and network demand using this ORAN infrastructure changes. And other than that, once you have this integration in place, you also have the ORAN architecture also offers a RIC, which is a integration controller. What it does is it automates your network monitoring, it automates your configuration, and it basically makes the changes as you need more coverage, more power, or reduction of the power. So these are the aspects that ORAN architecture offers collectively for the MNOs to reduce the CapEx and OpEx both.
Interesting. So Chad, from the operator's perspective, how do these architecture changes really, play out in scalability and cost?
They make our life easier. I think if you think through an analog DAS previously, we have the large head end. Before that, we have radios. We have attenuators. Before that, we have radios. Then we have BBUs. And we're cutting a lot of those steps out, right? So no more radios that interface, high power, then do an attenuator, power it all, power it down, then interface to the DAS. So there's CapEx savings right away. We don't have to buy those components. There's OpEx savings. We talked yesterday about the size of an analog DAS versus the size of digital DAS. That's less floor space that we've got to lease. It's easier on the venues that don't have to provide us these really large facilities for the old analog DASs. Then there's the forever OpEx, right? That larger power bill that we have to pay for HVAC to cool off the room that we just heated up, then we send it to a load to power it down, right? A lot of craziness there. So those all come into the TCO, both from a CapEx savings side and from an OpEx savings point of view. And then there's the other things that are really hard to measure from a TCO perspective, but already we're hearing about simplicity. I mean, the old analog DAS is complex. It's hard on our engineers, our technicians, our partners that work on that. So there's a savings there. Again, how do you put a financial number on that? It's kind of hard to measure, but it's there. And then finally, when we turn these things up, it's still hard to turn up a digital DAS. It's probably more than a long, hard weekend. But it's not nearly as hard as an analog DAS with so many different connectors and coax and fine-tuning the uplink. So it's really simplified our life.
Good, thank you. Any of the other panelists, would you guys like to add to that?
No, I would say, I think Chad made a very good point, right? I think the real key theme here is simplification. And simplification comes not only from the architecture design, but the operational management part. So I think as an ecosystem and industry, we need to pay attention to what does it take to simplify management of a complex system as we move towards the next generation of technologies.
You've been kind of quiet, Gilberto, which is unusual for you.
Well, I mean, I think our panelists here already cover all the points, really. The simplification is the key. The architecture changes so much when you go to that integration. When you're removing all those components, you're also removing not only the components, you're removing the labor that goes to the installation of that. The one things that you were saying, Chad, about the coaxial cable and so on. Now, those coaxial cable don't just needs to be purchased, not only needs to be installed, but very often they require cable trays. Very often they require for you to actually create walls or tear down walls and create construction around it. It's time-consuming, it's expensive. I have an example of one medium-sized arena we did, which we had to actually create a technical room in their garage. They used the garage. We took part of the garage to create a technical room because you need the space and you need all the infrastructure to do that. So it's not just the installation and buying the equipment, like what goes around it, it's actually pretty big. And removing it, it's obviously a big saving.
Yeah, interesting. So along those lines, we often hear people standing up with big claims and big numbers, around, 80%, 70%, huge saving, these huge savings, right? So how can you quantify these savings, right? And space, costs, energy, et cetera. So I mean, basically the question is, how does ORAN really deliver that ultimate business case for in-building?
Well, we can take some real examples. So medium-sized arena, what I was just mentioning before, if I use that as an example, that today, so it's deployed, so we know how much space and power it takes. It is 11 racks just to feed the DAS. 11 racks, 186,000 kilowatt per hour consumed every year, and 384 coaxial cable. I mean, those are real number. We know it's deployed. And when you move it to an ORAN interface, it gets down to 2 racks, no coaxial cable, and like 50,000 kilowatt hours per year. So the saving, it's really quantifiable because you are removing components that are obviously not, they were not designed to be an ecosystem. They were put together at best. I mean, it was for the longest time the only option. I think now through some of this collaboration that we have on this panel, many of that can be solved.
Good. Chad, do you have any comments on kind of the real world application?
Yeah, I think
of
I'll
savings?
just play off 2 points there. I mean, first is, that coax requires big overhead steel racks, right? And that needs reinforced, and we have to make sure we do that the right way. So with digital DAS and Open RAN, that goes away. And then the second point I'll make is we scrutinize the upfront CapEx, and we still should do that, right? That upfront CapEx is important. We should minimize that. But that OpEx is forever, right? 10 years later, you're still paying that floor space, that power bill, HVAC, right? It's that forever trailing OpEx that comes along with that digital DAS interface, ORAN, really allows us to minimize that.
Yeah, and so Shawnee, what drives those gains across a multi-vendor environment deployment?
I think there are multiple factors. One is, I think, Gilberto already covered and Chad covered the overall space and power. We are going to save a lot with the test head and BBU installed in the simple rack, COT server on the simple racks, which will save an enormous amount of space. The other aspect is, I think, in the ORAN that we offer is the automation. So if you look at the AI-powered applications that Samsung is developing, and I'm assuming that the ecosystem is working on, is basically to reduce the power when there is no need. So look at a building where you have multiple levels, and it's not occupied all the time, so you can shut off those radios using these applications, which is monitoring the DAS systems dynamically, real time. So these applications basically makes those changes in a real time to save much more energy for you. So that's another gain that I see. And from the third one is the OpEx. From the OpEx perspective, what I think will happen is because of this competition, I think all the equipments which are vendor specific are no longer going to be there. There will be a universalization of those equipments, which will essentially reduce the CapEx significantly in upcoming days.
Good. So Chad, back to you. What ORAN was, the initial deployments of ORAN were really in the macro network, right? And that obviously brought some value to the operator. How do you compare the value that was, really enabled by ORAN in the macro to now in building? I mean, how do you compare? Is one better than the other? Or?
Yeah, I think first AT&T wants ORAN everywhere. We went on macros, we went on small cells, and everything in between. So we're pushing hard to make that happen. Ben, I think as we think through the difference between the macro site and in building, is outdoor, we do have some flexibility, right? If we can't work real estate rights with a rooftop on the northeast corner, we've got other options, right? We could go to the northwest corner. We could go, you're not tied to that one specific location. With in-building, that's not true, right? You have one building. You need to get inside this building. You have to provide your customer service. So a difference with ORAN in-building is the last gentleman's presentation, right? With analog DAS, I can only see my customers through the head end, and from then it's phone calls and tickets where I'm hoping that it's being monitored and optimized. ORAN gives us full connectivity just like we have in our macro network, where I can see all the way down to the radio what's performing well and what isn't.
Gilberto, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think on top of that, I think the difference between what you see in the macro and what you see in building is for a vendor like us to play into the ORAN business. It's not easy when it comes to the macro, because I mean, for us, if as JMA, we would need to develop a radio to enter into the macro space. It would be tough. I mean, I would need to match the performance of radios of gentlemen like we have here, which they do a pretty good job at. So competing with product on the macro space with volume that are obviously smaller, it's complicated. In terms of, not technically, it's really the business case. When it comes to the in-building, I think one of the big differences is that since the architecture gets so much simplified, almost any DAS vendor, really, even if we're smaller, and even if we do less in terms of number of radio per year, which obviously drive the cost as in terms of economy of scale, you are reducing so much the complexity, and the architecture becomes so simpler that the benefit comes with that reduction and with that simplification. So there is an aspect of making ORAN successful in building due to the architectural simplification that it's not small. To me, it's very important, I think.
Yeah, good points. That operational piece really kind of hits home, right? You get visibility now that you didn't have before in a DAS. So let's kind of pivot now to opportunities, right? Like the opportunities that ORAN enablement of in-building systems could provide. So, Chad, what does really an ORAN-based architecture enable for new funding mechanisms? Specifically, can we finally? Cameron yesterday talked a lot about venue funded, enterprise funded. Does this help enable that?
Yeah, it really does. I think, actually, we step back. So yesterday, over lunch, I was chatting with a gentleman next to me, oversees technology for the Irvine company out in California. And as they think through the properties they own, both commercial and residential, wireless connectivity is a utility. I mean, you expect it to work. It's not, and all things being equal, if it doesn't work, that could change a buying decision. So it is a utility. It's required. And I think with the venue-funded model, it really makes it easy for operators to consider joining. Because with Open RAN, we get all that observability. We know the cost will be a lot lower than the old way of doing it. We know the OpEx forever expense will be lower. So it really encourages us to join. Before Open RAN, is that possible? Of course it is, but everything's more expensive, it's more complex. And if you're a venue owner, managing something that's open and digital DAS type interface is much simpler and easier and cheaper for you than a complex analog old school DAS.
Yeah, that's a very good point because often, certainly cost of today's way of doing it, or the traditional way of doing it, is a barrier to enterprise funding in itself. But one of the other big barriers is generally an enterprise wants to make sure all the major carriers are going to join the system that they buy, that they fund. So that's a very good point. If it makes it simpler and easier and more cost-effective for the operator to join, or even cost-effective for the enterprise to fund the whole thing to get multiple operators on the system, that's certainly an advantage. Gilberto, would you like to add anything to that?
Yeah, I think to Chad's point, so you make it easier for the operator, which any operator is really the service provider for that utility. So, and for an enterprise, from an enterprise perspective, you need to have a simple way to deploy it, to connect, to build, and even the skill set to build an head-end that is connected through ORAN versus an head-end that is connected to a radio with coaxial cable and RF. An enterprise doesn't possess any of those skill sets. When you move to digital infrastructure, especially in the integration, the enterprise might have part of that skill set. It's way easier also as a barrier for them to comprehend what they're doing. And to me, at the end of the day, if it's a utility, which I actually totally agree with that analogy, because, I mean, define a utility is something that you absolutely need. And we absolutely need cellular coverage, all of us. We do have 1 or 2 phones, everybody. You connect everything, and there is an expectation from anybody that your phone must work everywhere. So it's not that it's okay that in that building you have no coverage. That doesn't work. Nobody is okay with that. And so if it is a utility, any enterprise has somewhat an idea on how much they should spend for a utility. They know how much they should spend for their Wi-Fi infrastructure, they know the internet, they know how much they spend for their electricity, water, I mean, they know how much they spend for carpet. So when they look at the wireless solution, of course it has to be cost effective because, I mean, they're not in the business of wireless, they need it. Their building might have a bigger value with wireless, but they're not in that business. For them, it's a cost. And so that cost has to be minimized to be successful there.
Okay, thank you, Gilberto. Let's talk automation, right? We've heard several times listed in the last day or so, zero-touch provisioning. You know, Akhil, what is that? Why is it important, and what does it really mean for, you know, ORAN-enabled multi-vendor in-building architecture?
Now, this is a topic I'm very passionate about. So when it comes to one of the huge benefits that ORAN brings to the table is on the management layer. Like, how do you simplify operational aspects? Chad talked about it, right? This is a build that you get continuously, and the more you address simplification of the architecture from an operational point of view, the more benefits you realize. So with the ORAN architecture, we have the SMO framework, which gives us the opportunity to automate things much further than what we have done in the past. Whether it's through a hierarchical model or a hybrid model, what really at the end of the day when we talk about zero touches, can we ensure that we provide the visibility that does not stop at the head end but goes across the board in the terms that the operators are actually used to today, the way they do it in the RAN network on the macro side. And B is not only you take that visibility, but you make sure that you are using the right intelligence, whether it's through our apps or things like energy savings, so you can actually configure back the network. So with a combination of closed loop, which is more of actuating, simplifying your provision, and coupling that with the end-to-end visibility, this is where I think we can start bringing the operational costs down. So one aspect when it comes to that automation is about how do you provide that end-to-end visibility. So at Ericsson, we have the dot profile. We talked about dot as something that you can go and rip and replace like a light bulb. And it couples with the place where the enterprise is today. So it's not a one size that fits all. So there are scenarios where you would work with a DAS management system and then work it back towards an SMO kind of architecture to simplify the architecture. And in certain scenarios, you can actually simplify it by having that end-to-end view in this scenario like an Ericsson dot.
Okay, and then obviously, a lot more can be done remotely than needing to go on site to move things around.
The key is no truck rolls, right? That's the aim. You try to do as many things on the software side, not on the hardware side. And the third thing is if you get those two equations right, then you provide that observability and actuating it back.
Great. Shani, I'm really interested in your view on this.
Yeah, all brilliant points. I think what we need to understand is the zero-touch provisioning is not only automation, it's beyond that. If you look at it holistically, what we essentially need to solve is, number one, cost, speed, and the complexity of the network. These three verticals I think we need to solve. So with the traditional DAS systems, of course, you had vendor-specific equipments. Now you're moving towards the digital DAS. It will basically simplify the OpEx, as Chad mentioned. You don't need to train your skilled workers for a particular vendor. There will be a universalization, and you don't need to train those workers specifically for one vendor. I think there will be standard procedures will be written that will overall simplify the OpEx cost. And the second item is the time to market. I think more and more vendors are coming into this space, and MNOs can introduce any supplier anytime. That will increase the complexity of the network. So you cannot be just spending time on automation and taking forever. You need to limit the time to market. So the automation, the zero-touch provisioning has to standardize those complexities and finish the integration in a definite time. So the speed is important, in my opinion. And the third is, of course, the complexity. Once you have the mix and match of DAS and the BBU supplier, it's going to be very difficult for MNOs to manage. And the only way you can achieve that, simplify that complexity is through ZTP, which is zero-touch provisioning, which will simplify for the MNOs to manage the overall network. So these are the very important avenues that the MNOs have to work. There is no choice. I think this is the only way you can manage the mix and match configurations in the network.
Great. So sticking with you, let's turn to the issue of longevity, right? Customer puts this in, a venue puts this in. They want to make sure it's good for, at least 10 years, a 10-year life, right? That's kind of the lifespan that's looked at on these systems. So how, in this multi-vendor environment, right, obviously there's an ORAN interface, but multi-vendor, they both have to talk. How do we ensure, longevity and being able to keep up with standards and upgrades and features and things like that over that long period of time in a multi-vendor environment?
Right. So if you look at the paradigm shift, right, there are two aspects. One is the open interface through ORAN, and the second one is the softwareization of the entire stack. So if you look at it compared to the traditional DAS systems, we are moving more towards software. And once you move more towards software, you have more flexibility to change features, to add capacity, to increase the overall traffic profiles in your network. These are the avenues that the software provides. So once it provides you the avenues to growth and capacity, I think you have a long span where you can deploy the network once and it can last for a longer period of time. And other aspect is once you have the software, you also need to make sure the security is in place. All the advancements that are happening in the network are in place, which makes it easy for suppliers to adapt and put it across the network and deploy it in a fast manner. That essentially gives the life of the network much more than 5 years. I would say I think 10 years is definitely going to be there. And if you look at the architecture, the way the architecture is evolving from the software perspective, I think this is paving the path towards the 6G as well and 5G advance. So I think this whole advancement in the openness and the softwareization will give us enough life for MNOs to sustain the network.
Great. Akhil, I'll give you and Gilberto each.
No, I think I'll echo what Shania said, right? I think the key is softwareization, and the more we can build capabilities from a lifecycle point of view, the software-first approach, that helps address the longevity challenge. But also it's how you look at hardware, right? The more simplistic it can be in terms of replacing, whether it's in a 7-year, 10-year horizon, where you have the existing infrastructure already in play, whether it's the design of that venue or a stadium, or whether it's in a Class A building, running fibers in a way that's effective. So that way, I go back to that analogy, when you need to replace those equipments, it needs to be like changing a light bulb, right? So it's both a combination of hardware and software.
Gilberto?
Yeah, I think on the technology side, it's been covered very well. There is, of course, another important aspect. Through the ORAN and multi-vendor partnership, because, of course, you can't just work in silos. So at the end of the day, we are delivering together a network for the MNO as a customer, and maybe finally the enterprise as the paying customer. But at the end of the day, it's a one network. Especially now that it's more integrated, it's critical the type of partnership, regression testing, and work that as a DAS vendor, together with the O&M partner here, we have to do and we are doing, because that type of work together, work in the same lab, get the equipment in the same lab, and keep them, because we are introducing software. The BBU, the DU, whether it's virtual or physical, doesn't matter, it's introducing new software. Every time you do that, you need to make sure that you do it in lockstep. Because while ORAN it's enable us to do this finally with a standard, now that standard evolves, especially when it comes to cybersecurity, when it comes to some of the features. So it's critical that on top of the technology, which is needed, it's the necessary enabler, you have a strong partnership at the end to serve the MNO as a customer, and then the enterprise and whomever is the paying customer.
Yeah, it's a very good point. The partnerships in the industry you see growing actually stronger than multi-vendor partnerships. One of the partners actually has been the government. The U.S. government has been extremely supportive and been a proponent of ORAN for a variety of reasons. I'll throw this question to Chad. How has public policy and funding really moved the needle for ORAN in this initiative?
I'd say we would not be where we are today without incentive and funding from the NTIA. So a big thank you to the folks that made that happen. AT&T is a part of the Accord Lab here in Dallas. That's a partnership between us, Verizon, Docomo, and Geo, and nearly 24 vendors, including all the ones on the stage and most in the audience. So that is pushing ORAN forward. Behind that was another wave of funding with NOFO 2, which brought funding for radio innovation and radio commercialization and innovation. And again, a lot of winners. JMA is a winner. There's plenty of winners of NOFO 2 in the audience. And that really will make things go faster. Ben, I think back, I started in the late 90s. I had 8 or 9 different radio vendors I could pick from back then, many of which were both US-based or North American-based. And, 7, 8 years ago, we were down, at least on the macro outdoor, large-scale deployments. We were kind of down to 3 if you don't include the Chinese vendors. Now with ORAN, I'm back to many choices. So when I introduce new radios in our network, we RFP those radios. They go to the folks on the stage, the folks on the audience, and we have competition, which is good for everybody. It's good for us. It's good for the vendors. We have supply chain diversity. If something happened to a vendor or their financing, we've got options. So that's the NTIA side. On the other side, I'd say that the Department of War has come to the operators and the vendors to talk about their concerns, both domestically and needing to rapidly deploy networks all over the world and just make them easy to turn up and work. So there's a lot of private network questions we're getting from the Department of War and figuring out how we can support them, how our vendors can support them. I know, JMA, you're a leader in that space. You get a lot of those questions.
Absolutely. Thank you, Chad. Gilberto, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I think you mentioned the 2 critical aspects. So on one end, the government has been helping with being a customer. So the Department of War and the private networks that they need to deploy for their own use, it's always easier to accelerate or make it real a program when you have a buying entity. For good reason. I mean, they need to create this private network because they need these top security, super isolated from the rest of the world, and that's great because, as I said, you have a customer where you can deploy ORAN solution. On the other hand, I love to repeat what has been mentioned about the Accord, because the Accord Lab, to me, the interesting part about the name is that, and that says it all, it's really the program with NOFO 1, where AT&T is the leader, to facilitate this ecosystem. And the name says it. I mean, it starts with an A, which is acceleration, and it finishes with a D, which is deployments. I mean, the goal of NTIA was not just to create a lab and pair some vendor together for the sake of it. I mean, in the past that happened multiple times. It never really helps anybody because it's costly to do the integration. It's not cheap, and if you don't see the deployment at the end of the tunnel, many people will lose interest very quickly. With the intent of Accord to end up with a deployment, then when you make things real, then when you make partnership actually be fruitful and you put the best engineer to work on it because it's going to be beneficial for your company as well as for the others and at the end of the day for the operator.
Yeah. I mean, national security, it was kind of posed as a national security issue, right? I mean, you mentioned some of the things about the Department of War, but even the U.S. telecommunications infrastructure, make sure it's secure from attack and from foreign interests and things like that. Do you feel, Chad, that that, you know, ORAN is really putting us on a path to make that happen?
Absolutely. Again, I can RFP a radio to 5, 6 vendors with Open RAN. I know it's going to work. I don't want to make it sound like it's as easy as plug and play, right? There's an IoT profile. There's a little bit of gray in the standard, and the standard will get better. And then there's a lifecycle management piece. So we love the model of Wi-Fi, where if you see a Wi-Fi 6 symbol, you know it's going to work. And maybe there's a day a complex network like cellular can get there, but I mean, absolutely, the competition's there, and it's making a difference.
Fantastic. Well, this has been a fantastic discussion, guys. I really appreciate your participation, and I think we'll end it there, and I appreciate each of you joining us.